All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our latest ALTA Insights webinar. Hopefully it's not 90 or near 100 where you are in the Midwest. It's pretty warm, East Coast warm as well. So anyway, thanks for joining us. I'm Jeremy Yohe, ALTA's Vice President of Communications. And today you're gonna learn how to develop a structured action plan that will hopefully help you determine the correct staffing level you'll need to ensure profitability. If you've been on the webinars before, you know I always have a few housekeeping items to go over. Today's webinar is being recorded. You'll get an email with a link to the recording tomorrow, and you can always access all of our webinars at alta.org/webinars. If anytime you have a question, submit them through the questions box. We'll hold some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And I need to thank First American for sponsoring today's webinar. And before I introduce today's speaker, we have a short message from First American. All right, well, thank you for that nice message, First American. And with that, I'll introduce today's speaker. Quick nugget, our speaker's camera is not working, some tech issues, so you get to just see my face for the time being. Joining us today, we have Tish Bush. Tish is the principal trainer of agency education for First American Title Insurance Company. She also operates TDB Advisors, which specializes in operations management for the title and settlement industry. Tish has worked for large national underwriters, hiring, training, mentoring, and leading all aspects of operations. She has worked for title agents and title service vendors, launching new divisions, rebuilding operations, and managing the closure of companies. She has a reputation for successfully using metrics, data, and analytics to predict volume and staffing trends to successfully manage operations in both escalating and declining markets. So, you know, definitely an expert in this space, and we thank you for joining us today. And I will now give the keys over to Tish once I learn how to use GoToWebinar. I've only been using this for like, you know, a decade. Tish, I'll make you the presenter in a second, I promise.
Perfect. Always exciting, right?
Yes, there we go. All right.
Okay, let's see. All right. Jeremy, am I good? You can see, everyone can see my screen?
Yep, there we go. I'll pop off, but I'll still be here.
Oh, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you to ALTA and Jeremy for inviting me to present this or represent this today. And thank you to First American for sponsoring it for all of us. As I get started, First American has asked me to read a slide first, a disclaimer from their legal team. First American Title Insurance Company and the operating divisions thereof make no express or implied warranty respecting the information presented and assume no responsibility for errors or omissions. The following presentation is for informational purposes only and is not and may not be construed as legal advice. No third-party entity may rely upon anything contained herein when making legal and/or any other determinations regarding its managing, hiring, and expense management practices. And such third parties should consult with an attorney or others as deemed appropriate prior to embarking upon any specific course of action. This presentation may not be distributed without written permission from First American. So with that, let's jump in. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining me today and Jeremy with this. I kind of smile as I do webinars these days, just because as I present to live audiences, particularly on data and analytics, oftentimes I have the experience where people's eyes are glazing over or they start looking at their phones. In this way, I can just decide that everyone is fully engaged and enjoying the information in front of us. So thank you all for that. Our goals for today We're going to start by reviewing variables that impact staffing. There's definitely, no two companies are alike, even when they're across the street from each other. And we'll look and talk a little bit about that. We'll have a brief discussion of profit and loss targets. We'll look at how, to evaluate some of these critical data points that you really need to answer that question of how many employees do you need for a closing. So we'll start with orders, we'll look at headcount, we'll look at financials, and then we'll jump into kind of the meat of the course. We'll look at how to analyze those critical data points once you identify them. And then we'll close with the benefits of a structured action plan. I always think it's kind of fun too. So as I put my webinar content through ChatGPT, this is the summary that it came up with. So anyone that wants the Cliff Notes version of what we're going to talk about over the next, half hour, 45 minutes, here you go. I especially like this these days just because I think it shows that there's still value in the human element. Because as we run through the next few slides and content, I think you'll see there's a lot more than what came up in the summary for us today. So let's get started with what are the variables that impact staffing. I think, the statistical norms across the industry that to benchmark and to manage metrics just historically have been challenging. I mean, as you look at this and, the bullet points here, I mean, the geographic region, the way that you manage and close a transaction in California is uniquely different than how you manage a transaction in a state like New Jersey. The variabilities that apply, in that type of region or those types of regions are very different from one another. And the way you need to staff is very different. As you look at customers, you have your high touch customers, those that want to be updated on absolutely everything throughout that cycle of closing. And then you have some that just want it to close and know when their check's going to come in. Again, very different types of customers. Some of that could be based on relationships. Some of it could just be inherently present within the companies. Within customers, you may have some, I look at some that want their title products back within 24 hours. You have some that 10 days later aren't even looking for them. So I think there's a lot of variability within that as well. You can have customers that want a high volume of reports and data. And sometimes I shake my head and think, are you reading it when I send it to you? But then there's clients that want that. And when I send it to them, within an hour, they're on the phone picking apart every single line item on the data that was sent. So I think, there's a lot of variance there that has to be taken into consideration. The next one, as you look at your total closing volume and your staffing variances, an office with one person is uniquely different from how you run and manage that and what you need versus an office with 10 people, or an office with, 20 to 50 people, 50 to 100 people, 100 plus. It's just vastly different across that type of closing and headcount variances. Another one here would be the use of centralized teams. Do you have an information technology team, or is that what you're a one-man office, you are your IT team. The smaller companies may not have an HR department. It may be the manager has to fill in and do that, and that definitely is going to impact your staffing numbers. Another one to look at would be your accounting. Most companies, that I've had experience with do have some type of separation, which is quite good for accounting. But, a smaller accounting department could mean more functions on your staff. And that's a variable that's going to cause an impact. Compliancy with things like ALTA best practices or lender requirements, underwriters, requirements and audits. It's a lot easier if you're compliant within all those as people come in and kind of look under the hood, but it does take more staff. So that's something to consider. I think another one here, technology production, what platform are you in? And what are the workflows that you've set up? Does it take one click or does it take 10 clicks to accomplish something? How much have you optimized that within your system? And I think, there's a lot of great technology out there, but whatever your partner integrations are, as I've run different companies, in different career paths that I've had, it's such a great idea. Oh, we can buy this technology, we can buy that technology. But every time my staff has to log into another platform for something that they need, it becomes extra work for them and definitely extra time. So each of those need to be considered. And here I'll take kind of just a little pause. Here's the variables that I've discussed that impact staffing. In that chat box, do you have others variables in your businesses that impact your staffing? Does anything come to mind? Is there anything that's coming through, or should we keep going? I'm wondering if we may have some technical difficulties. I am going to keep going and look for a message from Jeremy at some point. So as we move from the variables into just our brief discussion about profit and loss targets, I guess my first strong suggestion is whoever your frontline influencer is. So if that's a manager, it could be a division head, depending on how your company's structured, but whoever your frontline person is, it's critical that they review the profit and loss statements that they get month over month. They should understand what's on them. They should understand what the labels are for each of the different categories there. And those can vary widely by company, but it's absolutely impactful on their ability to manage what's happening within that business unit. If something jumps up significantly month over month, they should understand what it was and why it happened. And there's no way to understand that other than, to really live that data, understand it, review it, ask questions. Hopefully that fixed it. The next thing would be to create a meaningful percentage goals by category. And I'm going to show you on the next slide a little bit more detail on that. That'll make sense, hopefully. My fixation is always on, from these influencers at the front line, what are expenses that they can control? You'll see payroll up there on the screen. I appreciate and understand, that's somewhat of a fixed number, but there's elements like overtime or temporary help that absolutely can be controlled and need to be controlled during lower volume periods. Things like marketing, postage, and as I look at that one, do you have to send everything overnight mail? If you do, does it have to be, priority overnight delivery? Could it be 2-day delivery? Do you have the opportunity with postage when you're sending out your policies? Can you, do that quickly enough so that excess recording fee check can go in the same envelope? Office supplies. I smile as I always say that one. I think in my career touched upon a number of people that are great at ordering the office supplies, but as you go into that supply cupboard, do we really need, every color of Post-it notes and every color of highlighters? Some of those can be minor expenses, but when you're in months of low volume and you're trying to just break even, that's definitely something that you can control. As you look at claims or shortages, I think your influencer there at the front line should intimately know what you've got there, always on claims. And on shortages, really, my benchmark has always been, I want to see anything $500 and over that I had a shortage on. Why? Why did it happen? Will it happen again? Do I have the right controls in place? Do I need to implement training for my staff on each of those? And then really at the end, what I'm looking at is what's my target net income percentage goal? So again, this is going to vary by company, but what you'll see here up on this slide is, at the top, I've got my gross revenue, which is the sum of all the different types of services I'm selling. And, here's 100%, I start with everything, my title fees, my settlement fees, if I've got accommodation closings, search fees, whatever's appropriate for your business. Then I'm going to subtract from that my cost of goods sold. So typically what you're going to find are things like search costs and remittances being paid to your underwriters. And that's usually around 20%. You'll notice I've got a little fudge factor in here of plus or minus 5%. As I look at my gross margin, my 100 minus 20 drops me down to 80%. And then I'm looking at my expenses. And these are ones that have been meaningful to me in businesses that I've been a part of. Payroll, where I'm including my overtime and my temporary staff. You may want to insert or measure your total employee costs. It may not just be those two. You may want to include, bonuses, healthcare, outside services, maybe even your payroll processing, whatever's applicable to your business. And obviously that percentage would change. Rent, typically is a little bit higher of a number. I appreciate that one from your frontline influencer is not as, something impactful for them. But then we get into your marketing, and you'll see here the postage, the office supplies, and the claims and shortages are all present. And then as you look at your sum of all your expenses, and then you're looking at, in this example, you're looking for a target net income of not less than 20%. So that's kind of the goal that I have used and have set throughout this presentation that we're going to touch upon more. So as we move into here, the critical data points, what we'll start with is looking at open order. And that seems like such a simple line item here, but really my experience has been you've got to be careful with your non-premium generating orders. So things like search work, exam work, businesses that are highly involved with auction. What I've seen happen is you may have those customers go into the auctions that are interested in really analyzing the title work on a lot of properties. That can absolutely drain your staff while those auctions are going on, and they may not win the bid. They may not get the business. You may not get a title order. Still doesn't mean that's not a great customer, but definitely something to be mindful of. I think in some states you'll have things like seller side processing where it's a low fee for a lot of work. And it doesn't mean it's not a good idea to take that in under your company umbrella. It just means you have to be aware of that as you look at your open order pipeline. The next here, and I smile before I move on, I've been a part of businesses where, isn't this great? We're doing this, and this team is going to benefit from a title order later on down the path, but this team is going to support it. Maybe it would be, the example I'm thinking of is, the notary service fee. So we're going to do every order at a loss on the notary side because we'll make it up on the title premium later. The problem is the P&L for that notary department or team is going to feel the impact of that. It's sort of the old adage, we're going to lose money on every order, but we'll make it up in volume. Absolutely, and with a different product. But those are decisions as you look at those P&Ls and you look at your volumes and your open orders that you have to be mindful of and you have to be discussing with your leadership team, particularly when you're responsible for your profit and loss statement. The next tier would be closed orders. And that's where we make money. So absolutely, I think that's top of mind for most businesses and most influencers. And your cancellation ratio, that's something you really want to keep your eyes on as well. What is it as you look at a run of data over 12 months or 36 months, but you want to look at that month over month to understand what's happening there. Make sure that as you're bringing in these orders and you're spending money on them, opening up the order, understand, do you have a good product up front and that's why it's coming in the door, but then they move it to someone else with your product to close it. Everyone understands that happens from time to time, but if that's the majority of what's going on, it may still be right for you, but you should understand that. The next one that I think is absolutely critical, and I really use it in most data measurements for operational teams, is your average days to close. It's pretty easy to measure that data. What day did you open the order? What day did you close the order? But you want to know what that is month over month. That's paramount in analyzing your pipelines, so that you'll know as this is opening, this is what I can expect as far as closings, revenue, staffing. And the last one here is the orders remaining in the pipeline. That one is so important, and that really ties to the one above it, the average days to close. What I'm suggesting here is that, and this has been my experience with my processors or my escrow officers, paralegals over the years, is that, there's a lot of pride in having a large caseload for a lot of staff in those categories. And sometimes what'll happen is they're not canceling what's in their pipeline. So as I go in and I look at it, and if, Mary tells me that she's got 200 files in her open pipeline, I want to look at when those orders were opened by date, because I'm going to know that if my average time to close is, 42 days, anything 42 days and over, I'm going to consider that to be somewhat stale, and I'm going to apply a lesser percentage of that. I'm really most concerned with what's in that open pipeline for those reasons. And it really helps me to analyze and to look at that. I don't know how we're doing, Jeremy. Typically what I would ask here is, how are others managing their open pipelines? Order volume index. I think we might still get some feedback. Not work. Seems like a good day. Like Amber and hour. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully there'll be some good stuff. I saw he just typed that in, so thank you. I will move us over to the next slide, still looking at critical data points. And this is to the headcount piece. So, this one on the surface seems like it's such an easy number. What is your number of total headcount? The problem with that one is it's kind of a loaded question. And I alluded to some of that in the introduction. You have to be mindful of how are your support team costs being applied. And those are where I was talking about your information technology, your human resources, accounting, post-closing. All that becomes a variable of your total headcount. And how are those costs being included, in your payroll numbers? I think this one's hit me for some of the bigger companies I've worked for over the years. A lot of times, I would do great on my profit and loss statements and on my management of them, not knowing that at the end of the year, I was going to incur an enormous administrative support allocation. So that would be, I'm going to be charged for the senior leadership team. And boy, was that a shock the first time it came around. A lot of times you can go from being a highly profitable team or department to one that's, in the red, depending on what those numbers are, not necessarily controllable from that frontline influencer, but something to be aware of, as you're looking at your numbers and having those discussions with, your leadership team. The other one that I had brought up before is you may here too want to insert just an overlay of what are your total employee costs as you're looking at some of this. So just something to be aware of, as you move through a lot of this. The next one here, orders per head count, closings per head count, somewhat simple math that most of us are fairly familiar with. And then, the last one here that I think is so helpful for a big part of this process is staff rankings. And what I mean by that is if I have a team of 20 people that report to me that are part of my profit and loss statement, I always want to have them in my mind or even on paper ranked. Who's my top performer? Who's at the bottom of my list? Who's 15 to 20 as far as my not top performers. I think that's probably a nice way of saying that. Some of what I'm going to suggest in a moment is that, the hardest thing to do is as you're looking at all this data and measuring it and measuring ways to be profitable is that there's going to be periods of downturn in volume where you need to make some hard decisions about your staff. And managers, as they should be, kind of in that mama or papa bear mentality, want to protect their teams. Knowing who's towards the bottom of that, 1 through 20 list example can kind of really aid leadership in those discussions. I think it also helps, I'm a huge proponent of hiring and for positions and promoting from within. Know who your star performers are, push their careers, help them. As you look at top places to work, one that comes up time and time again is career development. Companies that help with that, it's such a bonus for employees these days. So that's where, to me, this staff ranking is so important. Does anyone have any, I'm just going to pause for a moment. Does anyone have any additions to these that you would add? I think we could put that in the chat box.
Yeah. Hey, Tish, can you hear me now?
I can, yes, yep.
All right, I've been trying to interject and add comments, and well, apparently I was not muted and nothing was coming across, so I was been furiously changing things. So sorry about that.
Good to hear from you. Yeah.
Yeah. Just wanted to back up a little bit on the slide where you were talking about the profit and loss target slide, and a couple of questions from Todd. He was wondering, are these industry-wide expenses that that we should try to keep to, or these kind of averages that you've compiled?
Yeah, I mean, I've found them to be industry-wide, but it could just be the population of companies that I've worked with in my career path. So that's kind of a tough one, and I'm smiling as I'm saying this. I'm sorry you can't see me. I presented something like this at an ALTA conference, I don't know, when it was in Los Angeles, so I think that was 2019. And there were probably 50 people that waited to challenge me after that because they didn't agree with these numbers. And I think that's okay. I mean, that's where my suggestion is that they're almost uniquely different to companies. And that's where I think it's so important to know what's on your P&Ls and then to manage to it, watch what's happening. So I guess, sort of like the First American disclaimer, I'm somewhat adding a disclaimer to this with an explanation. And I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, and another question that he had also is when you were asking, how do they analyze the orders, and he looks at deals coming in, refis versus sales. So you definitely want to know, have a good understanding of the type of orders you're going to be getting.
Great point. Yeah, same with the other one I'd add to that would be like your home equity can be even, easier than your refi. So absolutely, that's a great addition.
All right, you got a quick shout out from Andrew Acker, who said he was your speaking partner in LA. So.
He was, and he left me, Andrew, by myself when everyone was challenging me. I'm teasing him because I adore Andrew.
Yeah,
it was pretty funny though.
Good guy. Apparently he knows when to, hit the door. So, that's it for the questions right now. But you also asked, let me post that in there too. You asked what variables do you have in your business that impact staffing? So anyone wants to, share some thoughts there, and we can also discuss that question. And I didn't mention at the top, the full slide deck is not available. However, Tish has provided a summary document that you can download now in the handout section. You'll also get an email tomorrow with a link to download that document as well. All right, Tish, no other questions are coming in or comments.
Okay, I think if I'm not mistaken, this is the last slide that we looked at. So I'm going to move from the total headcount into some of the financials. And Jeremy, if I'm incorrect on that, keep me honest. So for the financials are a little bit more cut and dried. Here, I mean, what I'm suggesting is that you really want to look at your gross revenue. You want to look at your total expenses. You want to look at your net income, both by a dollar amount and a percentage amount. And I'm going to show you in just a moment a template and then a little bit more about what I mean from some of this. I definitely think you want to look at what your average cost is per opening, and then you want to look at your average revenue per closing. And those are, I mean, that's most of that, and is pretty simple math to come up with. I know there's a lot of great programs out there. I just, probably a little bit more old school where I usually want to know what this is firsthand. And so a lot of times I'm doing this just in something as simple as Excel. I want to look at my employee cost per closing. And then this one to me is so critical. I want to know what the changes are. I want to look at them, month over month, quarter over quarter, and year over year. And I'm going to say this now, and I'll say it again, in a further slide, but I really don't like to look at data unless I have at least a year's worth of it. And I know sometimes when you're getting started on something, that's not possible. But I think, a 12-month to a 36-month run of data is most effective to be able to make the right decisions and analyze your data correctly. And now that we're up and running, Jeremy, I would pause and say, does anyone have any additions to these business financial inputs?
Yeah, I posed that question, what control expenses do you have in your business? Also, one of your questions that you had is if people share their P&L statements with frontline managers.
Yep.
That's interesting. I would think they would. I mean,
me too.
Is that, Tish, in your experience, what's kind of the percentage of companies that do or don't?
Shockingly, it was, for me, my experience has been a lot of times it's not even 50%. And I don't understand why, because I think those influencers are so critical in knowing how their actions and decisions impact the company.
Yeah, even at ALTA, the communications budget, we meet, quarterly just to review, what's the income coming in versus, our expenses. And if the income's not coming in appropriately, well, we need to find ways to get more income, or we need to adjust what we're spending.
Yeah. And I think that's the best way. I mean, and from what you've just shared, I mean, that's how people own it. Your influencers then own it when they understand it. And that's why I think it's so important.
Yeah, because they can see the bigger picture of, what they are doing impacts, the entire organization.
Right. All right. If there's nothing coming in, I'm going to move us. Don't be shy, everyone. There's no right or wrong answer here, just so you know. This is an easy one.
Todd has more a question on the industry standards, the numbers. He goes, he knows local has an impact, but is there an industry standard to look at?
So I know, and I didn't look at them as closely, and I'm ashamed of that right now with your question, Todd. I know that I saw ALTA published some data. I was working on something earlier this year and I saw it. If you want to reach out to me with your contact information, I'll do some research into that because I'd like to know the answer. And I should have done that, so I will absolutely do it now. That's the only thing I can think of that I've seen published. And I thought it was brilliant. I think you still have to
referring to the report ALTA did a couple years ago as far as like average, salary in each kind of regions.
I thought it was more head count based, like to some of this, but again, I didn't read it word for word. I just took note that it existed if I ever wanted to go back to it.
All right. Well, yeah. Follow up with us after the webinar. We'll see if we can get you some good data.
Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay.
Question about time per file from Tanya. Do you find that doing an average time per file for each department helpful or a waste of time? All files are so different.
I know. I think you want to know what the average is. And I like some of the time studies that I've seen out of production platforms where I could see, because I'm just thinking of like a closing. Wouldn't it be great if my people that worked on closings could do it from start to finish? But unfortunately they can't because they're dependent upon other actions happening. So there's a lot of start and stops. And you know what? That was the time study I couldn't think of. That one I've seen, that's what ALTA published, was a time study. And I think that data is valuable. I think there's so many different ways of going about it. Some of it's going to be manually done. And even though you're going to have such a wide range of times, I think you want to know what your average is. Because from that, and this is getting a little bit off of what I have in content here, but from that, then I know what I can expect from my staff. So, and I've managed teams where, and I know everyone's chin's going to hit the desk, but I mean, there are processors who, really high performing ones can close 100, 120 files a month. It kills them, but they can do it during those peak volume periods, and then I have staff that, can't come anywhere close to that. And that's not necessarily bad as I'm managing my teams, because I just have some top performers and I want to make sure I'm compensating them for what they're able to do. But there's no way for me to know to do that unless I have some hold on what my data is, on what those average numbers are. So I hope that helps, Tanya.
Yeah, Tish, ALTA has done several surveys that kind of, take a bite of the apple at different angles. There was a couple years ago the Title Agent Abstractors Operations Survey. That includes, data as far as how, agents measure their operations internally, externally versus other companies. There was the Industry Compensation Index, which that's the one I was thinking about a little bit ago. And then we just did last year a couple of other studies as far as how long does it take to work on a file, how long does it take to work on a difficult file, and that's done in hours. Now, to get that number, you would, obviously then have to multiply by, by the hourly rate that, that employee's making. But yeah, several different surveys. I'll post links in the chat box so everyone can check them out.
It's fantastic. Thank you for that. I just think that data is such a great place to start. I've used it, thousands of times, literally, as I go in and look at things. So I can't suggest that enough. Okay. So as we've talked through, that we talked about the headcount, we talked about financials, we talked about order volumes. Really, this here to me is the crux of taking that data, understanding it, and then creating this, what I just think of as a critical data point analysis. So, I'm looking at my open orders, I'm looking at my closed orders. I'm creating a closing ratio, and that is, and by that, what I mean is, and that falls into the one below it, I want to know how many orders are in my pipeline, and I want to apply that average days to close for my closing ratio. And as I'm talking, I'm going to move to the next slide because it'll make more sense. So here's what that template looks like. So you could see what I'm saying in that third column for the closing ratio is, I want to set up a formula that's based on my openings, my closings, and my average days to close. So for example, if my orders close on average in 30 days, what I'm going to do for my closing ratio is I'm going to do that calculation based on, if I were in February, I would want to know how many orders I brought in January that I'm expecting to close in February. So that's where I'm applying that type of logic. And you can see the next one, here is going to be whatever I've come up with my total number of employees when I did that review of my data. I want to know what my orders per head count are, and then what my closings per head count are. And those are, this is a formula you can set up in these. So you're only inputting, a minimal number of data or amount of data. Then I want to know my monthly net income by dollar amount and by percentage. And I'm going to show you, I know this is going to be hard to see, and I'm going to break this down year over year. But what I wanted to show here is that you could see, as I look at this year over year, my first year, it was slower months, and I did not do a good job of managing my openings and closings per head count. And you could see that I really hurt my overall. If my goal was 20% for my net income that year, I was only at 8.3%. So it really, kind of shows the run of data and how it's being managed. Let me go where you'll be able to see it more easily. So if this was my data in 2022, I can see here that, I'm losing quite a bit of money when I'm, only have 5 or 6 closings per head count. If you look at May's data, what you can see is when I have 9 open orders per head count, and I have almost 7.9 closings, you could see I'm starting to see what my break-even point is. And then you could see numbers beyond that. The other thing I would share here is this is where your review of your profit and loss statements becomes so critical, because some of what could be hitting me in a month like February that looks horrendous, I could have had a huge shortage. I could have had some kind of wire fraud that hit me and I had a big payout. I could have had a vendor back bill me on something. My accounting department, could be batching things up. And that's where I just have to know what it is so that I understand it and I can make sure I'm not making headcount adjustments on something like that. That's inherent within my business. I'm going to move to the next slide here, and this would be the next year of data. And you can see here again, when my number, look how much money I'm losing when my numbers, I have 6.8 closings per head count. The data's starting to tell a story to me is where I'm going with this. So I can kind of see that January is almost my, poster child. I'm just about breaking even at 9 orders and 8 closings per head count. You can see my bigger months where I'm doing better. And if you notice from the first slide to the second slide, my total headcount number here where I was really losing money, I had 36 to 38 employees, and then I started adjusting down. Here you can see same business, but now I've adjusted down and I've really tried to right size my staffing. You could see what a huge difference on my overall numbers. The other thing I want to suggest is just because you have a low month, this is where looking at it year over year and looking at your total net income here at the bottom, my goal is 20%. I've done a heck of a lot better. I'm going to have periods of downturn in volume. It's just part of our industry. That doesn't mean I want to go and release a bunch of people from my employ. I want to be careful with how much overtime I'm approving. Where do I have extra staff that have come in to help? There may still be stuff for them to do, but this probably isn't the month to have them do it. And I can control some of this a little bit easier, with better decisions like that. And each little thing can help you to break even. And some of those big numbers, again, remember, those could be something, back billing that you're catching up with. It could be, the other, claims or shortages I brought up. But as you look, and here's my 3rd year of the data, you can see I finally hit that, over 20% that I was looking for. And you could see, here I am, I lost just a little bit of money but I've right-sized my staffing a little bit more in my down volume periods. I've done a better job of managing my overtime, things that I have control over. And just to kind of summarize, this is where I've suggested, you really want, you can't easily make these decisions on a short run of data. You really need, I think ideal is 36, but even 12 to 24, you've got to take a look at it. And as I kind of walked you through, you're looking for your break even points on your net income. What does that look like? And then you're looking for, what is your target net income percentage? How do you reach that with some of this data management and expense management? And as I'd shared, it really is so dependent on that thorough profit and loss review, understanding what it is, and what you're really looking for there, where are your data anomalies? And I can tell you, some experiences that I've had, and it was very deep, but what I found was, I couldn't understand why search costs were so high in such a low volume period, only to find that, the billing had, if my memory serves me correct, and I'm getting old, so it may not, I want to say it had like tripled up on the billing that was coming in a high volume business unit. And by going in, and the data didn't make sense to me. Why would this be so high for such a, low volume period? And that's absolutely what I found. And a refund came in on that. Didn't help me that month when I was in the red, but it sure helped me later on. And that's why that's so critical to understand it and look at it in that manner. The next thing I want to kind of summarize or tie together after, that critical data analysis piece is there's got to be some kind of structured action plan that comes out of all this. I can't even count the number of times where this type of analysis was done and then no one wanted to act on the data. It may make sense, that example of the last year where everything had been right-sized and then there was a couple low periods. Again, not the right decision, I would think, for really any business to go and start reducing your headcount. But I think, in other times, it's something that you have to be aware of, and how those impacts, why those decisions need to be made, as rough as they could be. I think part of this action plan is you've got to review the results individually as appropriate within your business, whether it's by company, by office, by team, by department. I'm a firm believer in, those are hard discussions oftentimes to have. You should have a standard agenda. As your influencers and your frontline managers walk into that meeting, kind of like the annual review, there should be no surprises. They've looked at their P&Ls. They know how they're performing against these targets. They know what you're going to ask them, and they should be prepared to have that discussion with you. I think, I've always been one, as I've managed, teams and employees. I like to meet, informally, throughout the week, but I like to meet monthly. I think it's a good idea, no less than quarterly, particularly with a standard agenda and a discussion of this nature, so that they understand how they're pacing out. They understand, some tough decisions they may need to make. I always think of this as being a living project plan for performance, not just for that profit and loss statement, but for that team. And I think the best plans that I've been a part of is that the annual bonus for my frontline influencer, and really even for my team, is on them hitting those targets and goals. Not to say there could be things that impact them where you make exceptions, but I think, that's the way you're going to get buy-in, and that's going to result in your best performing teams, because they are a part of all of this. They have ownership in it as well. So, finally here, really in summary, we've talked about various business elements that are impacting your overall equation. So, and that's, the discussion surrounding, where are you regionally? How high touch are your customers? Are you a one-man shop? Are you a 10-man shop? How much have you optimized your systems? All that really makes a difference. I think it's so critical that you want to determine and communicate your net income goals with those influencers. And I know I've had a lot of discussion around that throughout this. Your continuous review of those critical data points. You've got to have an awareness of what's in your pipeline, how many people are sitting out there, what do your financials look like? And my advocation throughout this is that critical data point analysis really answers for you and your individual business that orders to headcount question. And I've been a part of a lot of companies where they know what the answer is, but they're not willing to do it. There was no structured action plan that was implemented. And that's where, finally, you've got to meet no less than quarterly, and you have to be willing to act on that data. It's not always easy, but it's critical. And my final slide here before we open it up for any other questions, comments, is I just thought this was kind of fun. So when I ran this through Chat GPT to summarize, what we just talked about, you can see beyond the Cliff Notes version. And I always just feel like I haven't become redundant by automated intelligence. So I always like looking at this kind of stuff. I hope you guys do too. Thank you. Jeremy, do we have any?
Yeah, we have had some questions come in. Yeah, something you want to ask Tish, submit it in the questions box. We've got another 10 minutes or so before we wrap up. What's a good place to get a template for financials? I mean, you can Google, and there's probably some free ones out there. Quicken Books probably has one for a fee, but any recommendation for anyone on the webinar today on where they can get a template?
Template like for profit and loss statements?
Yeah, yep.
Honestly, like I think most accounting software has something that kicks out. If you're not buying something like that, that would be my suggestion, would be to just look online. There's a lot of products out there.
You can probably ask ChatGPT too.
Yeah.
Got some questions on the types of orders. Question from Randy: what orders do you include in your order counts? Just purchase, or do you include search orders and others that may come in?
So I usually do both. I usually think of it as like my premium generating orders and then my non-premium generating orders. So I usually have a total number, but then I break it down with those two subcategories.
Okay. Do you have any insight, as you've worked with title companies, kind of what the average, for a company of orders that don't close, is it like 20%, 25%?
Yeah. I think the ones that have the loyal customers are usually, 20-ish%. I think, and again, this is based on my career experience, so it doesn't mean this is going to be right for you, but I think the more normal number that I've seen is more like 30%, sadly.
Yeah. Follow up from Gail on the template. She's curious, the templates that you used when you showed on your slides that had the head count, average head count, and then the percent profit.
Yep.
Yeah, she's probably curious, where do you find this? You built it?
I built it, yeah. I'm hesitating just because if Gail, if you want to reach out to me, I just have to make sure First American's okay with me providing this. They're probably going to want me to put a disclaimer on it. But I'd be happy to share it with you. Right. I'm sorry I didn't pre-ask that question of First American, so I'm reprimanding myself for that too, so I'm sorry.
That's all right. Well, hopefully Gail connect with Tish afterward, and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah.
All right, couple more questions coming in. Eileen asked, when you were talking about orders per month, when you say processors who close 120 per month, are those curative people or closers, or both?
Both, believe it or not. I mean, talk about high performers. That's the exception and not the rule, by the way. But I worked with 4 of them. It was crazy. And obviously, that's at the top of the compensation range I've ever seen for that type of position. Customers loved them. They were just phenomenal at what they did. An interesting fun fact for that, it was a very remote position. So I think these people just killed it because they loved the flexibility that they had with their personal life. It started during COVID, and then they just kept hitting it out of the park because they wanted to be able to still work in that remote type of environment.
Yeah. Eileen had a follow-up question. I'm not exactly sure what she's referring to in your presentation. So Eileen, if I get it wrong, maybe just pop in another question. It just says like your carry rate or your closed file count. I'm not sure if you can determine what that question is, or if not, we can just move on.
I'm not entirely sure what a carry rate is.
Yeah, I'm not
I'm
either. All right, we'll move on to the next question. Eileen, if you want to kind of explain that a little bit more, we will get back to it. Question on files and how long it takes. You know, is there a way to determine how long it takes to complete files? Is it just, you know, you have an employee say, I started at 1 and this date, and then this is when it closed, and just kind of track it that way?
I kind of have broken it down further than that. And usually if I'm trying to do that kind of time study, usually what I've done is I sit chair side with people so that I can start seeing what's involved in their tasks throughout the day. You know, that may lead then thereafter to, you know, follow-up questions or follow-up kind of data calls. So that I, you know, if I could see how many keystrokes or what the timing is from one click to another, depending on what the workflow is. But that's generally how I've gone about it.
Okay. All right. Question from your, you know, your partner in crime from a few years ago, Andrew. He's curious if most title production systems provide the necessary reporting, or do you need more thorough workflow reporting require using third-party software overlaid onto your title production software?
The data that I've seen coming out of most of the platforms I've been in has been so great in the last couple of years that some of those overlays, you know, if you go back 5 years, you needed all that overlay a lot more. But it seems like every time, you know, the new player enters the industry or they start doing upgrades to some of the current platforms, some of that base data reporting is quite good. It just kind of depends, you know, and again, I think that ties back to your optimization as well, though. You know, and by that, what I mean is like, if the timing can be harder to measure if there's only, you know, 10, you know, 1 click, 10 clicks, 20 clicks per process. But that's been my experience as far as what I can get out of these platforms. Some of it gets to who my staff is that's pulling it for me too. You know, I'm of the mindset whenever someone tells me, you know, the data doesn't exist, I think it does exist. You just have to have the right wizard to know how to grab it for you.
Absolutely. And, you know, and Andrew agreed with your shadowing of people. You know, the best way to understand where the bottlenecks are coming from, and you know, and accountability in their time. I was curious on the chart where you were showing, you know, the head count and, you know, the closed orders per month.
Mhm.
And obviously, you know, you want to hit that sweet spot. But what is that where, you know, you have 20 employees and you're getting, you know, more and more orders? Is that, trying to figure out how to phrase the question. Is there a point when there's too many orders and you just stress staff out? You know,
Oh
is
God,
it like
yeah.
15? Is it 16? And if you get to 17, people are like, I can't do another dang order.
Yeah, there definitely is. I mean, you look at some of these, you know, when they're so far above, and I don't know if this one has it as much as the others. You know, like look at these numbers where they're doing 13 per person, your break even was 9. Great for the business, but you're absolutely killing your staff. And I think you got to be aware of that, and you have to partner with your staff. That could be where, are there things you could pull off them to give to other people? You know, they're probably making a fortune in overtime, which is my experience. And the data I've looked at is that you're good with that for about 90 days. And then people want their work-life balance back. So, you know, thankfully for our industry, a lot of times that if you're a purchase shop, that carries you through the summer. People love it. And then you know, just kind of depends. But yes, I can't say that loudly enough. There is absolutely a point where you're destroying your staff.
Yeah. But as you mentioned, you know, you've got to prepare and you know, pay attention to the cycle, and, you know, get ahead of the curve when the market's starting to slow, and then, you know, ramp up when you anticipate the market to pick back up. Although,
And
you
know
know,
what your
right now it's
staffing
cut.
time is.
Sorry, go
Yeah, I was
ahead.
gonna say, sorry. Know what your staffing time is. I mean, you can't usually, you know, identify it and get someone in within 30 days. By the time you
Yeah.
post, you know, they give notice, you hire them, you onboard them. So yeah, that's where watching all this is so critical.
Yeah, and I guess, that's one way to attack it. One is to actually to have a plan. Then if you know vendors in the market that you could, reach out to, to outsource some work when times do pick up.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, well, let's see. We've exhausted the questions.
Perfect.
I guess we're at the top of the hour, so I guess we'll wrap up. I just let everyone know that, again, if you missed parts of today's webinar, you had a closing pop up, and you got in late. If you think others in your office would benefit from listening, you will get a recording of the presentation tomorrow, and you can always access our webinar archive at alta.org/webinars. Again, as a reminder, the summary document of the presentation that Tish provided will be in that email tomorrow. And I do need to thank First American again for sponsoring today's webinar. Tish, thank you as well for spending an hour with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, that will bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. Take care, everyone.
Bye.